The Sherman tank rumbled to a stop somewhere in the Bocage country of Normandy. July 1944. 5 British tankers had been buttoned up inside their steel box for nearly 6 hours, breathing fumes, sweat, and the metallic taste of cordite. The landscape had gone quiet. No German shells screaming overhead. No machine gun fire rattling against the hull. Finally, a chance to relax. The commander gave the order every crew member desperately wanted to hear. "Right, lads, let's brew up." Within minutes, the driver had clambered out, pulled a small primer stove from his kit, and began preparing tea on the engine deck. The wireless operator gathered the mugs. Another crew member fetched the tins of condensed milk and sugar. It was a ritual, as British as the Union Jack painted on their turret. For 10 precious minutes, these men would be human again, not just component parts of a fighting machine. Steam rose from the billion as the water began to boil. They never saw the German Panther positioning itself 300 meters away through the hedgerow. The first armor-piercing round punched through the Sherman's side armor before anyone could react. The second set, the fuel tanks ablaze. Of the 5 crew members, 3 died instantly. The 2 who escaped suffered burns across 60% of their bodies. The war diary of the 2nd F and 4 Yumri recorded it simply. 1 tank, 5 casualties, crew dismounted for tea. This wasn't an isolated incident. Throughout the North African campaign, from El Alamein in October 1942 onwards, British tank units reported similar losses. Crews would halt their vehicles, expose themselves to brutality, and present German anti-tank gunners with stationary targets. The ritual was so predictable that rare-acted training manuals specifically instructed gunners to wait for the British tea ceremony before firing. A motionless tank with crew members visible on the deck became what artillerymen called a brewer's zeal, a brewer's target. The mathematics were brutal. Analysis conducted by the Royal Armored Corps in late 1943 revealed that tank crews brewing externally spent an average of 12 minutes completely exposed and vulnerable. During those 12 minutes, situational awareness dropped to nearly zero. Men focused on kettles rather than scanning for threats. Reaction time to-enemy contact increased from roughly 4 seconds when buttoned up to over 30 seconds when dismounted. In armored warfare, that 26-second difference meant the space between life and death. Yet asking British soldiers to abandon tea was like asking them to fight naked. Since 1815, the British Army had issued tea rations to every soldier. By 1942, the daily allocation stood at 1/16 of an ounce per man, enough for roughly 6 strong brews. Tea wasn't merely refreshment. It was a psychological anchor, a taste of home, armament of normality in the industrialized horror of mechanized warfare. After watching their mates burn alive in knocked-out tanks, after breathing the sweet, sick smell of roasting human flesh, these men needed their brew. They needed those 10 minutes of humanity. The problem facing British military planners wasn't whether crews would stop making tea. They wouldn't. The question was how to let them brew without dying for it. The solution would require rethinking the very design of armored vehicles, installing equipment that would seem absurd to every other nation's military. But first, they needed to understand just how deeply tea had woven itself into the British martial identity. Understanding why British tankers risked death for a cuppa requires going back to the trenches of the First World War. In 1914, the British Army discovered something that would reshape military thinking. Hot tea delivered to frontline troops reduced shell-shock cases by nearly 40%. Medical officers noticed that men who received regular tea rations maintained better mental stability under bombardment than those who didn't. The War Office took notice. By 1916, the Army had established mobile tea brewing facilities that could serve thousands of men daily, even during major offensives along the SO. The science behind this wasn't mystical. It was biochemistry. Tea contains L-theanine, an amino acid that promotes alpha wave activity in the brain, inducing calm alertness without drowsiness. Combined with modest caffeine content, it provided exactly what soldiers needed, reduced anxiety whilst maintaining combat effectiveness. But more importantly, the ritual itself mattered. Boiling water, warming the pot, steeping the leaves. These familiar actions created brief islands of domestic normality in landscapes of pure destruction. A soldier holding a warm mug wasn't thinking about the artillery barrages scheduled for dawn. He was for 3 minutes back home. By 1939, tea had become so embedded in British military culture that the War Office classified it alongside ammunition as an essential supply. When the British Expeditionary Force deployed to France, each company carried specialized tea brewing equipment. Even during the chaotic Dunkirk evacuation in May and June 1940, when soldiers abandoned everything from artillery pieces to personal belongings, they brought their tea kettles. Ships rescuing men from the beaches reported that the most common question wasn't about food or medical care. It was when's tea? The North African campaign demonstrated tea's role beyond mere morale. In the desert, temperatures inside a tank could exceed 50 degrees C. Crews lost liters of water through perspiration during engagements. Dehydration impaired judgment, slowed reactions, and reduced combat effectiveness within hours. Medical officers found that crews who brewed tea regularly despite the risks actually performed better than those who didn't. The tannins in tea aided water absorption, whilst the ritual enforced regular hydration breaks. Men who should have been drinking water wouldn't, but they'd always find time for char. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery understood this viscerally. After assuming command of the 8th Army in August 1942, one of his first orders concerned tea supplies. He insisted that every forward unit maintain a minimum 3-day reserve of tea, sugar, and condensed milk, stocks that sometimes exceeded ammunition reserves. When logistics officers protested, Montgomery responded bluntly, "I can order men to fight without artillery support if necessary. I cannot order them to fight without tea. They simply won't do it properly." He wasn't exaggerating. In December 1942, during the pursuit following El Magny, the 7th Armored Division outran its supply lines. Wentia ran out after 3 days. Commanders reported disciplinary problems, reduced alertness, and declining morale. Men became irritable, less responsive to orders, and took unnecessary risks. One squadron leader noted in his diary, "The lads would charge a German position for a packet of players, but without char. They'll barely clean their weapons properly." American observers found this incomprehensible. General George Patton famously remarked that British troops would rather have tea than ammunition. He meant it as criticism, but British commanders wore it as a badge of honor. Their men didn't need motivational speeches or threats. They needed proper char. Everything else was negotiable. The challenge was keeping them alive long enough to enjoy it. The 22nd Armored Brigade kept meticulous records during Operation Crusader in November 1941. Over 17 days of combat operations in Libya, the brigade lost 43 tanks to action. Of these, 16 were destroyed whilst crews were dismounted making tea. That represented 37% of total losses. Not from superior German tactics or better armor, but from kettles. The brigade commander, Brigadier Scott Cockburn, wrote in his after-action report, "We are literally brewing ourselves to death." The pattern repeated across every theater where British armored units fought. In Tunisia during March 1943, the 6th Armored Division documented 29 crew casualties directly attributed to brewing stops. The Churchill tanks would halt, crews would dismount, and German 88 Doman anti-tank guns would open fire. The heavy Churchills couldn't accelerate quickly enough, even when buttoned up. Catching them stationary with crew exposed was target practice. One company lost 3 tanks in a single afternoon, all brewing up in the traditional sense before being brewed up in the tanker's grim euphemism for catastrophic fire. What made Thessalos's particularly gling was their preventability. Unlike casualties from combat maneuver or tactical necessity, these deaths served no military purpose whatsoever. A tank commander killed whilst reconnoitering enemy positions died doing his job. A driver killed whilst brewing tea died because he was thirsty. The Royal Armored Corps calculated that if every unrelated casualty had instead occurred during actual combat operations, British armored effectiveness would have increased by roughly 12%, the equivalent of adding an entire additional armored division to the order of battle. The Soviets receiving British tanks through Lendley couldn't fathom the behavior. Russian crews would observe their British counterparts brewing rituals with bewilderment. Soviet tankers drank vodka cold, ate cold rations, and stayed buttoned up unless absolutely necessary. A Red Army liaison officer stationed with the British 1st Armored Division in 1943 reported back to Moscow. The English possess adequate tanks and brave soldiers, but they insist on stopping to boil water in the middle of battles. This is either genius or madness. I cannot determine which. German intelligence officers certainly thought it genius for them. Captured documents from the 21st Panzer Division included standing orders to target British tanks that had been stationary for more than 5 minutes, as they were almost certainly brewing. Luftwaffe pilots received similar instructions. Look for small fires or steam near British positions indicating tea preparation. One German tankkazi, Otto Carrerius, described in his memoirs how his crew would deliberately wait for British tankers to dismount before engaging. Why shoot at a moving alert target when patience would give you a stationary one with the crew? Standing about like picnickers? The statistics grew worse in Italy. The mountainous terrain meant fewer places to hull down safely, and German positions on high ground provided excellent observation. Between September 1943 and May 1944, British tank losses in Italy included at least 74 vehicles caught during brewing stops. The Canadian 5th Armored Division, fighting alongside British units, adopted the same tea-drinking habits and suffered proportionate casualties. Their war diary for April 1944 includes this stark entry. Major Wilson killed along with his crew by mortar fire whilst preparing afternoon tea. The teapot survived intact. That last detail, the teapot surviving, captured the absurdity perfectly. Hardened steel and brave men reduced to scorched wreckage, but the enamel teapot sat undamaged in the dirt, still half full. Something had to change. The solution emerged not from generals or engineers, but from a 28-year-old electrical fitter named Peter Garlick, who'd served as a tank wireless operator in North Africa. Invalid home in early 1943 after his Grant tank took a direct hit near Tobruk. Garlick spent his recovery sketching designs in a Southampton hospital bed. His left hand was wrapped in bandages from burns he'd sustained. Ironically, not from enemy fire, but from scalding tea when his crew's Primus stove tipped during a hasty departure. The idea that kept him awake wasn't revenge against the Germans, but rather a simple question. Why couldn't tanks heat water the same way they heated themselves? Every tank possessed an electrical system that could generate significant power. The wireless sets alone required robust electrical supplies. More importantly, tanks had coolant systems, radiators filled with water that needed heating in cold weather and cooling in hot climates. Garlick's insight was brutally simple. Tap into the existing electrical system to heat a small water reservoir. No flames, no exposed crew, no dismounting, just a switch, 3 minutes wait, and hot water ready for tea. He submitted his sketches to the Ministry of Supply in March 1943. The military establishment's response was predictably dismissive. One senior officer at the War Office noted on Garlick's proposal, "Waste oversources. Tanks are for fighting, not catering." Another scribbled mollycoddling. What next? Armored bathrooms. The proposal might have died there, buried under bureaucratic disdain, except that it landed on the desk of Major Anthony Norman, himself a tank veteran who'd lost half his crew during a brewing stop in Libya. Norman recognized the idea's merit immediately and pushed it upward through channels until it reached the Directorate of Tank Design. By August 1943, a prototype existed, a cylindrical stainless steel vessel roughly the size of a large thermos, flask with an immersion heater element rated at 1000 W. The initial design could boil 1 pint of water in approximately 2 minutes using power from the tank's 24-volt electrical system. Engineers at the fighting vehicle proving establishment in Chobham mounted the prototype in a Churchill tank and conducted trials. The first test failed spectacularly. The vessel ruptured under pressure, spraying boiling water across the turret interior and scalding 2 test crew members. Back to the drawing board. The engineering challenges proved substantial. The vessel needed to withstand the vibrations and shocks of combat without leaking or breaking. It required insulation to prevent burns whilst remaining compact enough to fit into already cramped tank interiors. The electrical system had to be fail-safe. A short circuit in combat could disable the entire tank. Most critically, the heating element needed to operate reliably in temperatures ranging from -20 degrees in Russian winters to +50 in desert summers. Every component required testing, refinement, and retesting. A team at Mechanical Warfare Experimental Establishment, led by engineer Captain Ronald Hazelden, spent 9 months perfecting the design. They tested 43 different configurations, materials, and heating element types. The breakthrough came in April 1944 with a double-walled design featuring a vacuum layer for insulation, similar to a thermos flask but robust enough for military use. The heating element was encased in a copper sheath, preventing direct contact with water and reducing electrical hazard. A pressure relief valve prevented ruptures. The funnel design could boil a quart of water, enough for 6 mugs of tea in precisely minutes and 40 seconds. The unit weighed just over 3 lb empty and could be mounted almost anywhere with access to the electrical system. Installation required cutting a single hole for wiring and 2 mounting brackets. Most importantly, it worked. Trials in May 1944 demonstrated 97% reliability across 200 heating cycles. The boiling vessel was ready for war. The boiling vessel, officially designated the BV Electric Water Heating Unit, MKI, was installed in its first operational tanks in June 1944, just days after D-Day. The unit typically mounted on the turret interior wall, positioned where the loader or wireless operator could reach it without interfering with their primary duties. A simple toggle switch wired directly to the tank's main electrical bus-controlled operation. Flip it up, wait for the indicator light, and within minutes you had water hot enough to brew proper tea. The interior mechanism was elegantly straightforward. The heating element, a tightly coiled nichrome wire similar to those found in domestic electric kettles, sat encased in a copper tube at the vessel's base. When current flowed through the nichrome wire, electrical resistance generated heat. The copper casing distributed this heat evenly whilst protecting the wire from direct water contact. The double-walled construction created a vacuum layer that served dual purposes. It insulated the outer surface to prevent crew burns, and it retained heat, keeping water hot for up to 30 minutes after the element switched off. Capacity was precisely engineered for crew requirements. The standard BV held 1 imperial quart, 40 flue ounces, enough to fill 6 standard Army-issued tin mugs with water to spare for rinsing. The vessel's cylindrical shape, roughly 9 in tall and 4 in diameter, maximized volume whilst fitting into tight spaces. A screw-top lid with an integrated handle allowed safe pouring even during vehicle movement. The lid incorporated a pressure release valve calibrated tow vent at 15 per square in, preventing dangerous steam buildup if someone forgot to switch off the element. Operating the system became second nature for trained crews. The wireless operator, typically responsible for the BV, would fill it from the tank's water jerkins during lulls in combat or whilst stationary. Cold water in, lid secured, switch activated. The indicator light glowed red during heating. When water reached boiling point, a simple biometallic thermostat cut power automatically and the light switched to green. The entire process consumed roughly 0.3 kWh, negligible drain on the tank's batteries, which were continuously recharged by the engine's generator during operation. The thermostat proved crucial for safety and efficiency. Without it, crews might boil water dry, damaging the element or creating a fire hazard. The biometallic strip, 2 bonded metals with different expansion rates, bent as temperature increased. At 98 degrees C, the strip's curvature broke the electrical circuit, stopping current flow. As water cooled, the strip straightened. But the switch remained open until manually reset. This prevented the element from cycling on and off wastefully. Maintenance requirements were minimal but essential. Weekly inspections checked for limescale buildup, particularly problematic when using hard water from wells or streams. Crews learned to descale their BVs using vinegar requisitioned from field kitchens. A half-cup solution heated, then left to sit for 20 minutes, dissolved mineral deposits effectively. The copper heating element required visual inspection for corrosion or damage. Electrical connections needed periodic tightening, as vibration from driving and firing could loosen terminals over time. The system's reliability astonished even skeptical crews. Unlike Prima stoves that required priming, pumping, and could blow out in wind, the BV simply worked. No fuel to carry, no flames to extinguish hastily when enemy contact occurred, no telltale smoke to give away positions. One Sherman commander from the Sherwood Rangers Wymanry wrote in July 1944, "We've brewed up 40 times this week. Tea, that is not the other kind. Not once did we expose ourselves outside the tank. Jerry doesn't know when we're vulnerable anymore because we're never vulnerable." That last point mattered more than anyone initially realized. The tactical implications extended far beyond simple crew comfort. The Royal Armored Corps began tracking casualty data specifically related to the boiling vessel in August 1944, 2 months after initial deployment. The methodology was straightforward. Compare loss rates between BV-equipped units and those still using traditional brewing methods. 3 armored regiments in Normandy participated: the 23rd Hussars, the 34th County of London Yeomanry, and the East Riding Yeomanry. Over 6 weeks of continuous operations, these units recorded every instance where crews would have traditionally dismounted to bray, noting whether enemy contact occurred during these periods. The results were stark. BV-equipped tanks showed a 42% reduction in casualties during rest periods compared to the same unit's performance before installation. More tellingly, incidents of tanks being caught stationary and vulnerable dropped by 67%. The 23rd Hussars, which had lost 9 tanks to ambush during brewing stops between June and July, lost 0 tanks during equivalent situations in August and September after BV installation. Not merely fewer, none at all, the commanding officer noted. We still drink exactly as much tea. We simply don't die for it anymore. By October 1944, as British forces pushed into the Netherlands, sufficient data existed for comprehensive analysis. The Directorate of Armored Fighting Vehicles compiled reports from 17 regiments across 3 divisions. Before BV installation, these units averaged 3.7 casualties per week, attributable to exposed brewing activities. After installation, that figure dropped to 0.44 casualties per week, an 89% reduction. Extrapolated across the entire British armored force in Northwest Europe, the BV potentially prevented approximately 280 casualties monthly. The survival mathematics extended beyond direct enemy action. Tank crews operating in cold weather faced hypothermia risks during extended operations. In the bitter winter of 1944-45, temperatures in Holland and Germany frequently dropped below freezing. Before the BV, crews chose between dismounting to make warming tea, exposing themselves to both enemy fire and cold, or remaining buttoned up without hot drinks, risking hypothermia during long static periods. Medical officers in the Guards Armored Division reported that BV-equipped crews showed 31% fewer cold weather injuries than crews still using external brewing methods. The psychological impact proved equally quantifiable. Army psychiatrists studying combat fatigue, what the previous generation called shell shock, found that crews with immediate access to hot tea showed markedly better stress resilience. A study conducted by the Royal Army Medical Corps in December 1944 evaluated 340 tank crew members across multiple units. Those with Bs reported feeling in control of their environment at significantly higher rates than those without. The ability to brew tea at will without negotiating danger provided a sense of agency that reduced anxiety and improved decision-making under pressure. Perhaps most surprisingly, the BV improved crew cohesion. In traditional setups, 1 or 2 men dismounted to brew whilst others remained at stations, creating division between those who went outside and those who stayed inside. The BV made tea making a collective experience. Everyone remained together, sharing the ritual without splitting the crew. Squadron leaders reported fewer interpersonal conflicts and stronger unit bonds in BV-equipped tanks. The 2nd F and 4FAR Padre noted, "The men joke that they've gone from dying for a cuppa to living with one. Morale has never been higher." By January 1945, the evidence was overwhelming enough that the War Office mandated BV installation in all British armored vehicles as soon as manufacturing allowed. Tank production lines at Leland End. Vauxhall began fitting BVs as standard equipment, rather than field retrofits. The device that senior officers had dismissed, as mollycoddling 18 months earlier had become essential combat. Equipment with documented proof it kept soldiers alive. The tactical revolution arrived quietly, noticed first by junior officers rather than staff. Planners. Lieutenant James Hullman of the 1st Northamptonshire Yeomanry documented it in his diary entry for September 1944, remained in ambush position for 11 hours yesterday. Made tea 4 times, never broke concealment. Previously, an hour was our maximum before someone absolutely had to brew. This changes everything about how we can fight. He was right. Before the BV, British armored doctrine assumed that units needed to withdraw to safe positions every 2 to 3 hours for mandatory rest breaks. Not because the tanks required it. They could operate for days, but because the crews psychologically couldn't function without their tea ritual. Combat planners built these breaks into operational times the same way they scheduled refueling. With the BV, that constraint vanished. Tanks could maintain forward positions, hold ambush sites, or sustain pursuits far longer than previously possible. The impact on operational tempo was immediate. During the advance through Belgium in September 1944, the 11th Armored Division covered 250 mi in 6 days, a pace that would have been impossible under traditional brewing constraints. The division's after-action report specifically credited the BV. Crews remained fresh and alert throughout rapid advances. The ability to brew whilst moving or during brief halts eliminated the need for extended rest stops. We maintained pursuit momentum that previous generations of armored forces could not have sustained. Night operations benefited dramatically. Darkness had always complicated brewing. Lighting Prima stoves revealed positions, and the smell of burning paraffin carried for hundreds of meters. German patrols specifically searched for these telltale signs. The BV eliminated both problems entirely. No light, no smell, just silent electrical heating that gave away nothing. British units began conducting extended night patrols and ambushes that would have been unthinkable previously. The 7th Armored Division reported a 43% increase in successful night engagements after BV installation. Fuel consumption patterns shifted unexpectedly. Before the BV, crews often left engines idling during stops to run heaters in cold weather or to keep batteries charged for wireless sets. Idling consumed roughly 1 gallon of petrol per hour, substantial waste during extended halts. With the BV drawing minimal power, crews could shut down engines completely, knowing they could still make tea using battery power alone. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment calculated they reduced fuel consumption by approximately 8% through this practice alone, extending operational range significantly. The smoke discipline advantages took longer to recognize, but proved equally valuable. Primer stoves and solid fuel cookers produced visible smoke that gave away positions, particularly in early morning or late evening, when temperature inversions trapped smoke at ground level. Reconnaissance units had always struggled with this. They needed to observe enemy positions for hours, but couldn't brew without compromising concealment. The BV solved this entirely. The Inns of Court Regiment serving as divisional reconnaissance reported they could now maintain observation posts 3 times longer than before. Combat effectiveness during sustained operations improved measurably. The human body and mind deteriorate rapidly without regular hydration, particularly during high-stress situations. Before the BV, crews might go 6 or 7 hours without drinking adequately because brewing was too dangerous or disruptive. This led to decision-making errors, slowed reactions, and reduced combat performance with constant access to hot drinks. Crews maintained hydration and mental acuity throughout extended engagements. Squadron commanders reported noticeably sharper performance during the 2nd and 3rd days of continuous operations. Perhaps most intriguingly, the BV enabled deception tactics never before possible. British units began deliberately positioning tanks in exposed locations whilst actually pulling back their infantry. German observers accustomed to attacking tanks whose crews were dismounted, Forte would engage what they thought were vulnerable targets, only to find the tanks were fully crewed, alert and ready for immediate maneuver. The 15th 19th King's Royal successfully employed this tactic near Venlo in October 1944, drawing German armor into a prepared kill zone. The boiling vessel had accidentally rewritten armored warfare doctrine. The British Army entered peacetime in 1945 with the boiling vessel firmly established as standard equipment. What military planners hadn't anticipated was how rapidly other nations would abandon their mockery and adopt the concept themselves. The first convert was Canada, whose armored corps had witnessed the BV's effectiveness firsthand in Northwest Europe. By 1947, Canadian military specifications required hot water systems in all new armored vehicle designs. The Australians followed in 1948, then New Zealand in 1950. American resistance lasted longest, rooted in the same rugged individualism that had made Patton dismiss British tea drinking. U.S. armored forces relied on instant coffee and cold rations throughout the Korean War, maintaining their reputation for toughness over comfort. But casualty statistics told an uncomfortable story. American tank crews in Korea showed higher rates of frostbite, dehydration, and cold weather injuries than their British Commonwealth counterparts operating identical vehicles, the only difference being the BV installation. In 1954, the U.S. Army quietly began installing crew comfort heating systems in M48 pattern tanks. They refused to call them kettles, but the principle was identical. The Soviets proved most pragmatic. After capturing several British tanks equipped with BVs during post-war military exercises, Soviet engineers reverse-engineered the design. By 1953, Russian armored vehicles featured the KIP-5 system. Officially, the complex individual no-go-patania or individual nutrition kit, but functionally a direct copy of the British BV. The Cold War irony was delicious. Communist tankers brewing tea using capitalist technology, whilst capitalist Americans finally admitted that perhaps comfort and combat effectiveness weren't mutually exclusive. Modern main battle tanks from virtually every nation now incorporated ascendants of Garlick's original design. The British Challenger 2, introduced in 1998, features an advanced BV capable of boiling water in under 90 seconds and maintaining temperature for over an hour. American M1 Abrams tanks, despite their crew's coffee preference, include similar systems. German Leopard 2s, French L-Clerks, Israeli Maravas all feature integrated water heating. The principle has become so fundamental that NATO standardization agreements specify minimum requirements for crew heating and water systems in armored vehicles. The technology itself has evolved significantly. Modern systems incorporate microwave heating rather than immersion elements, boiling water in under 60 seconds. Some feature separate compartments for heating ration packs simultaneously with water. The British Army's current BV can produce boiling water even when the main engine is off, using auxiliary power units that previous generations of tanks lacked. Touchscreen controls have replaced toggle switches, and automated cleaning cycles prevent limescale buildup that crews once scrubbed manually with vinegar. Yet the fundamental insight remains unchanged. Crews who can maintain basic human comfort without compromising safety perform better, survive longer, and fight more effectively. What seemed like British eccentricity in 1944, installing kettles in combat vehicles, has become accepted military wisdom worldwide. The U.S. Army's own field manual, FM 320.15, now states, explicitly, crew sustainment systems, including water heating capability, directly contributed to operational effectiveness and should be maintained as mission-essential equipment. The veterans who first used the BV are nearly all gone now, but their legacy sits in every modern armored vehicle, a small cylindrical vessel that represents something larger than tea. It represents the recognition that soldiers are humans first, fighting machines second. That keeping them alive, comfortable, and psychologically stable isn't mollycoddling. It's operational necessity. Peter Garlick, the wireless operator who sketched designs in a Southampton hospital bed, died in 1989. He never sought recognition for his invention, never applied for patents, never requested honors. He simply saw a problem and fixed it. His kettle saved thousands of lives and changed warfare forever, all for a proper cup of tea.